It was the morning of October 25, 1957, and the barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel on 7th Avenue in midtown Manhattan carried the quiet hum of razors and low conversation. The hotel stood at the corner of 55th Street, a respectable establishment where businessmen and politicians came for meetings, where the lobby gleamed with polished marble and discretion. But on this particular morning, the most feared man in the American underworld had just settled into chair number 4. Albert Anastasia reclined in the barber's chair, a white cloth draped across his broad chest and shoulders. At 55 years old, he remained powerfully built, a man whose mere presence could empty rooms or silence conversations. His bodyguard, Anthony Coppola, had stepped away moments earlier, decision that would later become the subject of endless speculation and investigation. The barber worked carefully, professionally, as he always did when Anastasia came for his regular appointments. Outside, Manhattan moved through its normal rhythms, unaware that one of the most consequential murders in organized crime history was moments away from unfolding. Anastasia had not always been the boss of a crime family. He had clawed his way up through decades of violence, cunning, and absolute ruthlessness. Born Umberto Anastasio in Calabria, Italy, he had arrived in America as a teenager, around 1919, already hardened by poverty and already comfortable with violence. He had jumped ship in New York Harbor, entered the country illegally, and immediately gravitated toward the waterfront rackets, where Italian and Jewish gangsters were carving out criminal empires along the Brooklyn docks. By the early 1920s, Anastasia had attached himself to Joe Mafia, one of the two dominant Sicilian bosses fighting for control of New York's underworld. When the Castellamore's War erupted in 1930, a bloody conflict between Mafia and his rival Salvatore Maranzano in Zano, when Anastasia proved himself invaluable. He was a killer without hesitation, without conscience, without the slightest moral reservation about taking human life. While other gangsters might order murders from a distance, Anastasia often carried them out personally, using ice picks, guns, rope, knives, whatever the situation demanded. When Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky engineered the murders of both Mafia and Maranzano in 1931, creating the modern commission structure that would govern La Cosa Nostra for decades, Anastasia emerged as one of the new organization's most valuable enforcers. He became the operational head of what the newspapers would later call Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate. From his base in Brooklyn, Anastasia commanded a network of professional killers who carried out contracts across the country. The organization was ruthlessly efficient. A boss in Kansas City needed a problem eliminated. A Cleveland family needed to send a message. Detroit required someone to disappear. Murder, Inc. provided the service. For nearly a decade, from the early 1930s through 1940, Anastasia and his chief lieutenant, Louis Buhalter, oversaw hundreds of contract killings. The exact number remains unknown. Estimates range from 400 to over 1,000 murders carried out on behalf of the syndicate. Anastasia earned the nickname the Lord High Executioner, a title he wore without shame. He understood that fear was currency in the underworld, that his reputation for violence gave him power that transcended mere muscle. When Murder, Inc. finally collapsed in the early 1940s, brought down by the testimony of informant Abe Reels, who detailed the organization's operations before mysteriously falling from a Coney Island hotel window while under police protection, Anastasia somehow avoided prosecution. He had been too careful, too insulated from the actual mechanics of the killing contracts. While Buhalter went to the electric chair in 1944, Anastasia walked free. By 1951, Anastasia had positioned himself to seize control of the crime family then led by Vincent Mangano. The Mangano family controlled Brooklyn's waterfront, a lucrative territory that Anastasia had coveted for years. When Vincent Mangano disappeared in April 1951, his body never found his brother. Philip Mangano was discovered shot to death in a marsh in Sheepshead Bay. Suspicion immediately fell on Anastasia. He claimed self-defense, insisted that Vincent Mangano had been planning to kill him, and the commission, lacking proof and wary of Anastasia's reputational, allowed him to assume control of the family. As boss, Anastasia expanded his operations beyond the Brooklyn waterfront. He moved into labor racketeering, loan sharking, gambling operations across multiple states. He maintained his seat on the commission, participating in the governance of the national mafia structure. But his leadership style troubled other bosses. He remained violently unpredictable, ordering killings that seemed unnecessary, that drew unwanted attention. He had recently become obsessed with Cuban casino operations, attempting to muscle into the Havana gambling empire that Meyer Lansky and Santo Trafficante controlled. This created friction with multiple families who had existing interests in Cuba. More troubling to the commission was Anastasia's apparent disregard for the careful political balance that kept the Mafia functioning. He had allegedly authorized the killing of Arnold Schuster, a civilian who had identified bank robber Willie Sutton to police. The murder of a civilian who had nothing to do with organized crime violated fundamental Mafia protocol and brought unnecessary heat from law enforcement. Other bosses began to view Anastasia as a liability, a man whose violent instincts now threatened the entire organization. Within his own family, Carlo Gambino watched and calculated. Gambino served as Anastasia's underboss, a position of power but also subordination. He was everything Anastasia was not: patient, subtle, politically sophisticated. Where Anastasia ruled through fear and violence, Gambino built alliances through careful negotiation and strategic patience. He had been quietly meeting with Vito Genovese, another boss with ambitions that extended beyond his current position. Together, they recognized that Anastasia had become vulnerable, that his erratic behavior had created an opportunity. The two men entered the Park Sheraton Hotel through the main entrance on 7th Avenue. They moved with purpose, but not urgency. Their fedoras pulled low, scarves wrapped around the lower portions of their faces. In the lobby, they drew no particular attention. October mornings in Manhattan often brought men in overcoats and scarves, protection against the autumn chill. They walked past the front desk, past the elevators, toward the hotel's ground floor barbershop. Arthur Grasso, the barber, attending to Anastasia, had just applied hot towels to his client's face and was preparing to begin the shave. The shop's owner, Joseph Bocchino, worked in another chair. A shoeshine stand sat near the entrance. The space was ordinary, mundane, a place where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. Anastasia sat with his eyes closed beneath the hot towels, relaxed, vulnerable in a way he rarely allowed himself to be in public. The two men pushed through the barbershop entrance at approximately 10:15 in the morning. They did not announce themselves. They did not speak. They simply raised their weapons, handguns, likely .38 caliber revolvers based on later ballistic analysis, and opened fire. The first shots caught Grasso completely off guard. He dropped his razor and threw himself toward the floor, scrambling for cover. Bocchino also dove for safety, abandoning his customer and crawling toward the back of the shop. The shoeshine attendant ran for the street exit. Within seconds, the barbershop had emptied of everyone except Anastasia and his executioners. Anastasia, hit multiple times, somehow managed to rise from the barber chair. The hot towels fell away from his face. Blood spread across the white cloth draped over his chest. In what witnesses would later describe as an almost reflexive response, perhaps muscle memory from decades of street violence, he lunged toward the mirror on the wall in front of him, apparently attempting to reach his attacker's reflections, unable, in his confusion and shock, to distinguish the glass images from the actual gunmen behind him. The shooters continued firing. Bullets struck Anastasia in the back of the head, in the neck, in his torso. The barber chair became soaked with blood. The mirror shattered. Shell casings clattered across the tile floor. The entire assault lasted perhaps 15 seconds, maybe 20. When the gunmen finally stopped shooting, Anastasia collapsed onto the barbershop floor. His body sprawled between the overturned chair and the wall. The two shooters turned and walked out of the barbershop with the same measured pace they had entered. They moved through the hotel lobby, pushed through the exit doors onto 7th Avenue, and disappeared into the Manhattan morning. They left behind no identification, no clear trail, no witnesses who could provide detailed descriptions beyond general build and clothing. Within minutes, they had vanished completely into the city's anonymous crowds. Inside the barbershop, chaos erupted. Hotel staff rushed in to find Anastasia's body on the floor, blood pooling around him, the mirror destroyed, the barber chair overturned. Someone called for an ambulance, someone else called the police. Arthur Grasso, shaking and pale, emerged from where he had hidden behind the chairs. He would tell investigators that he recognized nothing about the shooters, that everything had happened too fast, that he had been too focused on survival to observe useful details. Albert Anastasia was pronounced dead either at the scene or shortly after arrival at the hospital. Accounts differ on this specific detail. He had been shot at least 5 times, possibly as many as 7 or 8, depending on which ballistic reports are consulted. The exact number of wounds became less important than the fundamental reality. The most feared killer in American organized crime had been executed in broad daylight. In midtown Manhattan, in a hotel barbershop. The investigation that followed proved frustratingly inconclusive. NYPD homicide detectives interviewed dozens of witnesses, examined the crime scene, collected the shell casings and bullets, analyzed blood spatter patterns. They quickly focused on Anthony Coppola, Anastasia's bodyguard, whose absence from the barbershop at the moment of the shooting seemed impossibly convenient. Coppola claimed he had stepped out to make a phone call, that he had seen nothing, heard nothing until the shots were already being fired. Investigators suspected he had been paid off or threatened into abandoning his post, but they could never prove it. Coppola maintained his story and was never charged. The identity of the actual shooters became the subject of intense speculation that continues to this day. Several theories emerged, each with varying degrees of credibility. Some investigators believed the Gallo brothers Leary Albert and Joey Gallo had carried out the contract. The Gallos operated out of Brooklyn, had ambitions that exceeded their current status, and were known to be reckless enough to attempt such a brazen public execution. They had recently aligned themselves with various factions, unhappy with the current power structure. However, no concrete evidence ever linked them to the barbershop. Other theories pointed toward soldiers from Vito Genovese's crime family. Genovese had been orchestrating a power play to position himself as boss of bosses, and eliminating Anastasia served his ambitions. He had the resources, the motivation, and the ruthlessness to order such a hit. Some investigators theorized that the shooters might have been brought in from out of state, specifically for this contract professional. Killers with no connections to New York who could execute the hit and disappear before anyone could identify them. What became clear in the days and weeks following the assassination was that the murder had been sanctioned at the highest levels of organized crime. This was not a rogue operation by ambitious underlings. This was a commission-approved execution, a decision made by multiple crime family bosses who had collectively determined that Anastasia had become too unstable, too dangerous, too problematic to remain in power. Within hours of Anastasia's death, Carlo Gambino moved to consolidate control of the crime family. There was no violent succession struggle, no internal war for leadership. The transition occurred smoothly, almost seamlessly, suggesting it had been planned well in advance. Gambino had the backing of other commission members, particularly Genovese, and within days he had secured his position as the new boss of what would now become known as the Gambino crime family. The assassination of Albert Anastasia did not occur in isolation. It was part of a larger power realignment within the American Mafia, a carefully orchestrated series of moves designed to shift control and eliminate obstacles. Vito Genovese had been positioning himself for months, building alliances, identifying which bosses would support his ambitions and which represented threats. Anastasia's murder was one piece of a broader strategy. Carlo Gambino understood this perfectly. He had not acted alone in authorizing the hit on his own boss. He had coordinated with Genovese, with other commission members, with the Meyer-Lansky faction that controlled significant gambling interests. The conspiracy extended across multiple crime families, united by their shared assessment that Anastasia had become a liability. His death served everyone's interests. It removed an unpredictable element from the commission. It opened up territory for redistribution, and it sent a clear message that even the most feared boss could be eliminated if he threatened the larger organization. Gambino moved immediately to secure his position. He met with his capos, consolidated loyalty within the ranks, ensured that no ambitious underboss or soldier would challenge his succession. The family's lucrative operations, the waterfront rackets, the labor union control, the gambling networks, the loan sharking operations continued without interruption. Gambino proved to be everything Anastasia had not been: patient, strategic, politically sophisticated. He would go on to lead the family for nearly 2 decades, expanding its power and influence far beyond what Anastasia had achieved, precisely because he understood that survival in the Mafia required subtlety and political acumen, not just violence and intimidation. But Vito Genovese's triumph proved short-lived. Less than 3 weeks after Anastasia's murder, on November 14, 1957. Law enforcement stumbled upon a gathering that would fundamentally alter the American Mafia's trajectory. Over 100 crime bosses from across the country had assembled at Joseph Barbara's estate in Appalachian, New York, for a commission meeting intended to solidify the new power structure following Anastasia's elimination and to discuss national narcotics policy. A New York State police sergeant named Edgar Croswell noticed the unusual number of expensive cars with out-of-state license plates converging on the rural property and decided to investigate. When he and his officers approached the estate, the assembled bosses panicked and fled, scrambling through the woods in their expensive suits, abandoning their vehicles, creating a chaotic scene that state troopers easily documented. The Appalachian raid exposed the national structure of La Cosa Nostra to the public and to federal law enforcement in a way that decades of investigation had failed to accomplish. The fallout proved devastating for Genovese and for organized crime generally. The FBI, which under J. Edgar Hoover had long denied the existence of a national mafia organization, could no longer maintain that fiction. Robert Kennedy, then serving as counsel to the Senate Rackets Committee, used the Appalachian revelations to build political support for an aggressive federal campaign against organized crime. The Commission's authority had been publicly revealed, its members identified, its operations documented. Genovese himself became a primary target. In 1959, just 2 years after orchestrating Anastasia's murder and attempting to position himself as the dominant boss, Genovese was arrested on federal narcotics conspiracy charges. The case was built largely on the testimony of informant Nelson Cantalopes, a Puerto Rican drug dealer who detailed Genovese's involvement in heroin trafficking. Genovese was convicted in 1959 and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He would die behind bars in 1969, never having achieved the supremacy he had sought. The investigation into Anastasia's actual murder continued for years, but never resulted in charges. The NYPD pursued multiple leads, interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, analyzed every piece of physical evidence recovered from the barbershop. They developed theories about the shooters' identities, about who had paid them, about the specific mechanics of how the contract had been arranged. But theories are not evidence, and evidence that would hold up in court never materialized. The Gallo brothers remained suspects for years. Joey Gallo's subsequent behavior, his increasing erraticism, his violent conflict with the Colombo family, his eventual assassination at Umberto's clam house in 1972 seemed to confirm his involvement in the broader power struggles of the late 1950s. But no witness ever definitively placed the Gallos at the Park Sheraton Hotel on October 25, 1957. No physical evidence connected them to the murder weapon. No informant ever provided testimony that could be corroborated. Similarly, theories about Genovese's family shooters or out-of-state contractors remained just that, theories. The professional execution of the hit, the clean escape, the lack of forensic evidence, all suggested experienced killers who understood how to avoid leaving trails. But experienced killers are precisely the ones who know not to talk, who understand that survival depends on silence. Anthony Coppola, the bodyguard whose convenient absence had enabled the assassination, lived with suspicion for the rest of his life. Law enforcement never stopped believing he had been complicit, that he had either been paid off or threatened into abandoning his post at the crucial moment. But suspicion is not proof, and Coppola never confessed, never provided information, never broke his silence. The irony of Anastasia's death did not escape observers at the time or historians later. A man who had orchestrated hundreds of murders, who had built his entire career on violence and intimidation, who had earned the title Lord High Executioner, had himself been executed in the most vulnerable of circumstances. The killer had been killed. The enforcer had been eliminated. The man who had terrorized the underworld for 3 decades had died in a barber's chair. Unable to defend himself, unable to fight back, reduced in his final moments to lunging at mirror reflections while bullets tore through his body. The Park Sheraton Hotel barbershop became, for a time, a macabre tourist attraction. People would walk past, point at the windows, discuss the murder that had happened there. The hotel eventually closed and was converted into other uses. The barbershop itself was renovated, rebuilt, erased. The chair where Anastasia died was removed. The shattered mirror was replaced. The physical evidence of the assassination gradually disappeared, leaving only photographs, police reports, and the enduring mystery of who actually pulled the trigger. Carlo Gambino went on to become one of the most successful crime bosses in American history. Under his leadership, The Gambino family expanded into new territories, refined its operations, avoided the kind of public spectacles that had characterized Anastasia's reign. Gambino understood that the modern mafia needed to operate in the shadows, to avoid attention, to corrupt quietly rather than intimidate openly. He died of natural causes in 1976, having never been convicted of a serious crime, having built an organization that would survive his death and continue operating for decades. The murder of Albert Anastasia marked a turning point in American organized crime. It demonstrated that even the most feared boss could be eliminated if he threatened the larger structure. It showed that violence alone was insufficient to maintain power, that political sophistication and alliance building mattered more than intimidation. And it proved that the Commission would enforce its own rules, even against members who had helped establish those rules decades earlier. The Barbershop assassination remains one of the most famous unsolved murders in American criminal history. Despite decades of investigation, despite countless theories, despite testimony from informants in unrelated cases, no one has ever been charged with killing Albert Anastasia. The two men who walked into the Park Sheraton Hotel on that October morning, who fired 7 shots into the Lord High Executioner, who walked out and disappeared into Manhattan, their identities remain officially unknown.